first of all, the impeachment inquiry is a scam. The conversation that I had with the Ukrainian president, Zelensky, was a very good it was a very cordial, very good conversation. The mistake they made, the opponents, the opposition, the Democrats, the radical left, deep state, whatever you want to call them, they came out with a whistleblower report before they saw the conversation. Had they waited one day, Nancy Pelosi wouldn't have made a fool out of herself, and she would have been able to say what I said, because when she saw it, she said, this is not what the whistleblower said. I'll tell you what, they should really be looked at very strongly, because what they did is unthinkable. What they did to this country is unthinkable. And it's lucky that I'm the president, because I guess, I don't know what, a lot of people said very few people could handle it. I sort of thrive on it. You know why? Because it's so important that we get to the bottom. We went through the whole Mueller scam, 2.5 years. We went through that, and I had 3-4 days where it was like over. And then I'm walking into the United Nations, and they released it as I'm walking in, Mr. Ambassador. I'm walking in. I'm going to meet with, I won't name, but one of the top leaders of the world. And I see up on the screen, and people start screaming about this scam called impeachment. You can't impeach a president for doing a great job. You can't impeach a president for having the lowest and best unemployment numbers that we've had in 51 years. You can't impeach a president for tax cuts and regulation cuts and creating, and even the ambassador would say, the strongest economy in the world. We have the strongest economy in the world. This is a scam, and the people are wise to it. And that's why my polls went up. I think they said 17 points in the last 2 or 3 days. I've never had that one. I've never had that one. So I think it's very sad for our country. I think it makes it harder to do my job. But I do my job, and I do it better than anybody's done it for the first 2.5.
The history of American impeachment, how the presidents of the United States were removed. Donald Trump is far from the only one who has been charged. Impeachment is an extreme measure, which indicates that the political crisis in the country has reached a very serious scale, and politicians do not see the possibility of negotiating to bridge the gap. In world history, the process of impeachment is not so common. It is much easier to let the discredited politician finalize before the next election and end his political career in the most legitimate and worthy way. However, often events develop so that politicians do not want to wait and begin the process of removing the leader from power. There are few such cases, even less often they succeed, but not one of them passes without a trace. Now everyone is hearing another process aimed at removing Donald Trump from power, and it is extremely specific, and with what exactly, let's try to figure it out. What kind of impeachment beast? The concept of impeachment first appeared in 1376 in England. The date may be somewhat surprising. Europe only entered the late Middle Ages, and the power of the monarchs in most countries was weakly limited, if at all limited at least by something. Nevertheless, in England for more than 100 years, by the time an elected parliament was functioning. The authority of those times differs from the present one, just as modern England with planes and televisions differs from itself in the era of knights and castles. Nevertheless, even then, the elected representatives of the aristocracy realized the need to have tools to remove unwanted leaders from power. Of course, there was no question of any removal of the king, and could not go. In those days, it was impossible to even think of such a thing, but royal ministers often set out under the wrath of parliamentarians, setting the general course followed by the country. However, initially it was not the impeachment procedure that arose, but another mechanism, the Bill of Opal, which was adopted in relation to an individual and should have received the approval of the king. As a rule, the monarch did not dare to go against the will of the aristocracy, which was able to rally enough to demand the trial of his associate. As a result of the adoption of such bills, some prominent lords were executed, determining the course of the country's development. And what to do in a situation where the king is not ready to support the demand of aristocrats and refuses to bring his minister to court? This question arose before the English Parliament during the reign of Edward I. Then the country was in a difficult economic situation, which was worsened by a difficult war with France. At the same time, the king himself supported his favorites, who continued to follow the old course. In such a situation, the Parliament has developed an impeachment procedure in order to gain control over the activities of the monarch's advisors and punished. Then the procedure was as follows. Parliament was to bring charges and support them. The charges were brought by the House of Commons, which consisted of elected small aristocrats, and supported by the House of Lords, where noble and influential nobles sat. In order to bring charges, more than half the votes of members of the lower house were enough. To convict a person, 2/3 of the votes of noble lords were required. The king did not have the right to pardon or return to office the person to whom the Parliament impeached. This system for centuries has allowed the English aristocracy to fight the favourites of the kings. With the progress of the political system in the UK, this procedure faded into the background until it was last used in 1806. However, before becoming part of the history of England, an article on impeachment migrated to the US Constitution, where it is still actively used. Moreover, the Americans took the whole concept from the British. The elected congressman should receive a majority in the House of Representatives so that the charges are brought forward, and the senators, like the once noble lords of England, must support this law with 2/3 of the vote. Only in this case does the president lose power. The conditions are difficult to fulfill, but in the United States there have been at least a few notable attempts to impeach the president. Southerner in the North. The life of Andrew Johnson deserves to be filmed on it. Before becoming President of the United States, he managed to survive a lot. Johnson was born into a family of a poor North Carolina farmer. After his father's death he was apprenticed to a tailor, and his whole life did not portend that he would ever lead a whole state. But a successful marriage to the daughter of a shoemaker and a huge thirst for knowledge opened up great prospects for the young man. He moved to Tennessee, where he opened his own business and began speaking at a local college debate. Johnson was probably an excellent speaker, because he soon became quite famous. Already at the age of 25, Andrew Johnson was elected a member of the Legislative Assembly of Tennessee. 10 years later he went to represent the state in the Capitol, and 10 years later he became the head of his new small homeland. In 1857, he was elected a senator and again went to Washington to represent his state already as a senator, but the Civil War soon broke out. Andrew Johnson was the only Southern senator who supported the Union and defended the territorial integrity of the country. As you know, Tennessee supported the Southern Confederation, but quickly enough was occupied by the Army of the North. Johnson was still respected for his views and therefore accepted the offer of Abraham Lincoln to become the military governor of the state. A few years later, Lincoln elected Johnson as his vice president and won the election. Just a month after the inauguration, Lincoln was killed and Andrew Johnson took over as president. It was here that the president's strange behavior began. He broke all ties with the Democratic Party that advanced him and began openly supporting the defeated states of the South. The activities of the new president called into question all the fruits of the victory of the North in the Civil War. Johnson vetoed the bill on the conditions for allowing the southern states back into the Union, considering them humiliating, and also did not sign the law on civil equality of black people. The president had a conflict with the ministers, and Johnson tried to dismiss one of them. Congress reversed this decision, but the president persisted. Then the deputies began the impeachment of the president, while gaining 126 votes in favor in the House of Representatives with 47 votes against. Admittedly, Johnson was incredibly close to impeachment. 35 senators spoke in favor of removing the president from power and only 19 voted against. For the required 2/3 of the total number of senators, only one vote was missing. Johnson was able to stay in power, but not for long. In the next election he was not even nominated for a presidency. However, he remained very popular among Southerners, which allowed him to return to his native state and be his governor until his death in 1875. Watergate. Everyone has heard about the term Watergate. The name of the hotel has long been a household name and is applied without reference to the history of wiretapping. The suffix gate is used at all in many languages, to describe the significance of the scandal. And it so happened that everyone was accustomed to believing that wiretapping at the headquarters of Democratic presidential candidate George McGovern was almost the only means by which President Nixon tried to maintain his power. Funny, but it is not at all. Richard Nixon remained an extremely popular politician before the election, while his rival was divorced from the Democratic base and reflected very radical views, for which he was ridiculed by the president. By and large, Nixon did not need this wiretap at all. And frankly, there is still no convincing evidence. In the election itself, Nixon won in 49 states out of 50, only Massachusetts did not submit to the president. In addition, McGovern was able to win the metropolitan area of Columbia, but otherwise the result was phenomenal. After this victory, no one could have imagined that the Nixon presidency would end early, and de facto, in view of the impeachment, which was not officially announced, but reached its goal. The president left his post. Then Nixon buried himself not so much by the very fact of wiretapping opponents from the Democratic Party, but by how long and hard he tried to interfere with justice. The president flatly refused to transmit the films with all the conversations he had in the White House with his supporters. In response to the demand of one of the prosecutors to publish them, the president demanded that Attorney General Elliot Richardson dismiss this lawyer. The prosecutor general refused, and then resigned. At the same time, the US Supreme Court ruled that the president is obliged to present the same films to the prosecutor's office, and this became a key point in the impeachment case. There was no evidence on the tapes of how Nixon instructed to get into the Watergate Hotel and spy on McGovern's headquarters, but there was discussion of how to prevent the investigation of this story with the help of the FBI and the CIA. After the publication of these audio recordings, even the most loyal supporters renounced Nixon, and Republican senators promised one by one to support the prosecution on all counts. As a result, Nixon was forced to resign in order to avoid the shameful removal from power and not to be imprisoned. Impeachment actually achieved its goal. Oral office. The third case of high-profile impeachment occurred recently, then charges were brought against Bill Clinton. It is believed that the reason for this was his relationship with Monica Lewinsky, but again the key role in this process was played not by the president's sins, but by his attempts to cover up the tracks, which actually directly led him to investigate the case of perjury. The Lewinsky case initially took place completely without Monica Lewinsky. President Clinton was accused of harassing a civil servant, Paul Jones, during his tenure as governor of Arkansas. Then the topic of sexual contact with Monica Lewinsky came up implicitly, and the president swore a fatal phrase, "I had no sexual relationship with this woman, Miss Lewinsky." There is no sexual relationship. Literally a few days later, Monica was called for interrogation, and, not only did she indicate otherwise, she also brought her dress with traces of Bill Clinton's sperm. It became pointless to deny, the US president lied under oath, and his first lady was desperately trying to hide it. However, Clinton continued to persist, stating that he had nothing more than oral sex with an intern. After investigating the details, Congress indicted the president for obstructing justice and swearing lies. Then he passed the vote to the Senate. However, in both houses, the vote was emphasized by the party, and if in the Congress, where the majority were Republicans, the charges were supported, then in the Senate 2/3 of the votes were not among the Republicans, and the Democrats flatly refused to support the charges against their president. Bill Clinton held on to the presidency until the end of his term, but then this story repeatedly popped up loudly regarding the Clinton couple and even continued to interfere with Hillary during the 2016 elections, that is, nearly 20 years later. Trump case. Of course, speaking of impeachment, one cannot fail to mention the scandal that is unfolding now in the United States due to Trump's call to the president of Ukraine Zelensky. Although the call was more likely an occasion, calls for impeachment of the 45th President of the United States have been heard for a long time by activists and members of the Democratic Party. According to prosecutors, Trump tried to provoke the President of Ukraine to begin an investigation into the activities of ex-Vice President of the Democrat Joe Biden and his son Hunter in this country. The situation now looks like a party split. Among Republicans, the president's ratings are at over 90% support, and Democrats, in a single rush, do not accept Trump's activities. With a high probability in this investigation, the issue of party affiliation will prevail over the question of the real guilt of the head of the White House. Traces of this are already visible. An anonymous informant, from whose complaint the investigation began, is a supporter of the Democratic Party. This makes it possible for Republicans to blame their eternal opponents for fabricating evidence of the president's non-existent crimes. Much is at stake. Both parties are at great risk. In just a year, presidential and parliamentary elections will be held simultaneously. If the opinion that Trump is guilty and really tried to drag Ukraine into the internal affairs of the United States will be more popular, then for the Republican Party these elections can end very badly, the loss of both the presidency and the majority in the Senate. At the same time, if the American people make sure that the president is innocent and the Democrats are playing a dirty game against him, this could lead to a total victory for the Republicans and Trump's triumph. As for the impeachment itself, for now it seems unlikely. In the Senate the majority are members of the same party president and they are unlikely to split in half to support the accusations against him. In such a situation, the most likely scenario is impeachment of Clinton with a purely party vote, but not one of the options should be ruled out in advance, because President Nixon also enjoyed the support of Republicans. For the time being.